A king on a throne refuses to free a nation of slaves. A shepherd with a wooden staff returns from the desert and tells him the God of the Hebrews demands their release. What follows is the most concentrated demonstration of divine power in the Hebrew Bible. 10 plagues, 40 days of escalating ruin. One kingdom that would never be the same again. Each plague was not a random disaster. Each was a precise theological strike against one specific Egyptian god, named on the temple walls of Karnak and Memphis: Hapi, god of the Nile; Heqet, goddess of frogs; Geb, god of the dust; Khepri, scarab, god of the dawn; Hathor and Apis, the cattle gods; Sekhmet, goddess of plague; Nut, goddess of the sky; Senehem, god of crops; Ra, the high sun god; and finally Pharaoh himself. 10 gods called out by name. 10 pillars of Egyptian religion broken in public. 10 chances offered to the most powerful man in the ancient world to bend before he broke. And here is what most readers of Exodus miss completely. The plagues are not random punishment. They are proclamation. Each one is a courtroom verdict. Each said the same thing in a louder voice than the last. The God of Israel is greater than every god of Egypt. This video is the real story of the 10 plagues. The Hebrew word for each. The Egyptian deity each one targeted. The escalating pattern. And the moment Pharaoh finally broke. We will walk through them in the exact order Exodus records. Exactly the order Moses delivered them in the courts of Pharaoh at the city of Ramesses. You will see why blood came first. Why frogs were a humiliation, not a horror. Why the magicians stopped competing at the 3rd plague. Why Pharaoh's own court begged him to surrender at the 8th. You will see the geography. The Nile Delta. The land of Goshen, where the Hebrew slaves dwelt untouched. The royal palace of Ramesses. The granite temples of Thebes. You will see the magicians, the court advisors, the Egyptian gods carved in stone that did not move when their domains collapsed at their feet. And by the end, you will see why, on the night of the 10th plague, every Hebrew home was painted with lamb's blood, and the angel of death looked at the doorpost and passed over. Welcome to every plague of Egypt, told in the order they fell on a kingdom of gods that was about to learn there is only one God. 10 plagues, 10 gods, 1 judgment, 1 Passover lamb. Let me show you exactly how it happened. The Hebrew word for plague is makkah, meaning a blow, a stroke, a wound that does not heal until it is finally acknowledged by the one who received. The story opens 4 centuries after Joseph saved Egypt from famine. The Hebrews have multiplied into a population of roughly 2 million slaves working in the brick yards of the eastern delta. A new Pharaoh sits on the throne who knew not Joseph. The Hebrews are forced labor. Hebrew baby boys are being thrown into the Nile by royal decree. One Hebrew baby is hidden in a reed basket and floated downstream into the arms of Pharaoh's own daughter. She names him Moshe, Moses, drawn out of the water. 80 years later, he stands barefoot before a burning bush in the Sinai wilderness, while a voice declares, "I am," and sends him back to Egypt with a wooden staff in his hand. Moses returns with his older brother Aaron. They walk into Pharaoh's throne room and deliver the first sentence in the conflict. "Let my people go." Pharaoh laughs. "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then the contest begins. Aaron's wooden staff turns into a serpent on the marble floor. The court magicians match him. Aaron's serpent swallows theirs whole. Pharaoh's heart hardens. The Hebrew word caved means literally to make heavy, to make stone. His heart becomes a tomb that no plague will be able to crack open easily. And so the 10 plagues begin. Not as random calamities, but as a precisely choreographed theological courtroom in which every Egyptian god is summoned by name and found wanting. The first plague, the Nile River itself, the lifeblood of Egypt, the cradle of every harvest, every fishery, every bath, every bowl of bread on every Egyptian table. The Hebrew word here is dam, blood. The phrase Moses delivers is, "The river will be turned to blood." Not stained red, not poison. Blood. Pharaoh comes down to the Nile in the morning, surrounded by court attendants and incense bearers in the daily ritual of greeting the river god at dawn. Moses and Aaron are already standing on the riverbank waiting for him. Aaron lifts his wooden staff over the water at the Lord's command. The water turns to blood. Not a tributary, the whole Nile, every canal, every cistern, every clay water jar already drawn into Egyptian kitchens. Fish die by the millions and float to the surface in vast silver carpets. The river stinks across the entire delta. Egypt cannot drink. Egypt cannot wash. Egypt cannot bathe. Egyptian families dig small pits along the banks of the Nile, hoping that water filtered through sand will be drinkable. For 7 days they live by these holes in the mud. The court magicians use sleight of hand and small dishes of trickery to replicate the effect on a smaller scale. They prove they can match it. They cannot reverse it. And in the land of Goshen, where the Hebrew slaves draw water from their own wells, the water remains clear and cold and pure as it always was. The Egyptian god struck down by name in this plague is Hapi, the god of the Nile, the bearded blue-green deity carved on every temple wall, holding lotus flowers and pouring out the river's annual flood. Hapi was supposed to be the source of all life in Egypt. The annual inundation of the Nile was his gift. To strike the Nile itself was to strike Hapi at his own source. Pharaoh turns away from the riverbank without a word. He walks back into his palace, and the door closes behind him. His heart hardened. 7 days pass. The water remains blood. The fish keep rotting. The smell rises over the entire delta and reaches into the temples of Memphis and Thebes. On the 7th day, the river runs clear again on its own. Pharaoh interprets this as a sign of his own God's strength returning. He has learned nothing. Plague 1. Hapi the river god, exposed as powerless. The first verdict has been delivered. The next is already on its way. The second plague, a nation of slaves serving a kingdom of gods, is about to learn that even its sacred symbols can become its torment. The Hebrew word here is tsephardia, frog. Aaron stretches his staff over the rivers and ponds and canals of Egypt. Frogs come up by the million. Frogs in the kitchens. Frogs in the bedchambers. Frogs in the kneading troughs of every baker. Frogs in the very throne room of Pharaoh. An Egyptian housewife wakes in the morning to find her sleeping mat alive with hundreds of small green bodies. She cannot put her bare foot on the floor. Pharaoh's own bed is covered with them. They climb the legs of the gilded throne. They sit unbothered on the lap of the seated king of Egypt. The Egyptian magicians, eager to prove they too can summon plagues, call up even more frogs and add to the catastrophe instead of relieving it. Egyptian families try to gather and crush the frogs by the basket load, but they replace themselves before sunset. Every garden becomes a stinking carpet of small dying bodies. And in the land of Goshen, the Hebrew slaves draw water and bake bread in homes that are quiet and empty of frogs at every hour of the day. The Egyptian goddess struck down by name in this plague is Heqet, the frog-headed goddess of fertility, midwifery, and birth. Depicted as a woman with the head of a frog squatting in a temple sanctuary, Heqet was the goddess Egyptian women prayed to during childbirth. To send millions of frogs as a curse was to weaponize her own sacred image against her own people. Pharaoh, for the first time, summons Moses and pleads, "Entreat your God to take the frogs away from me and from my people, and I will let your people go to sacrifice in the wilderness." Moses asks Pharaoh to set the time. Pharaoh chooses tomorrow, perhaps testing whether the God of the Hebrews can keep an appointed hour. By morning, the frogs are dead in massive piles. Egyptian servants gather them into mountains across the city. The land stinks of frog bodies for days, but the moment the suffering stops, Pharaoh's heart hardens again. He breaks his promise within hours. He does not release Israel. Plague 2. Heqet, the goddess of birth, exposed as powerless. The second verdict has been delivered. Pharaoh has chosen pride over reprieve. The third plague, The first plague delivered without warning. The first plague Egyptian magicians fail to replicate. The first plague that strikes the priesthood at its core. The Hebrew word here is kinim, biting gnats or lice. Aaron strikes the dust of the earth with his staff, and the dust itself becomes living swarms. Tiny biting insects rise up from the soil in thick clouds. They settle into the hair of every Egyptian and the hide of every animal in the country. An Egyptian priest preparing for ritual finds his shaved scalp crawling with lice. Egyptian priests required total ceremonial purity. Any insect on their skin disqualified them from temple service. Egyptian temple liturgy halts across the land. The morning offerings cannot be made. The chant lines stand empty. The altars grow cold. Egyptian women try to shake out their hair and bathe with natron, but the swarms return faster than they can be brushed away. Egyptian cattle lie in the dust, scratching themselves raw. Donkeys roll in the mud, trying to suffocate the swarms. Fields go untended, because no laborer can stand still in the open. And in the land of Goshen, the Hebrew slaves work the brick pits and walk the irrigation channels with their hair clean and their backs unbitten. For the first time, the court magicians are forced to admit defeat. They turn to Pharaoh and say, "This is the finger of God. We cannot reproduce it." The Egyptian god struck down by name in this plague is Geb, the god of the earth itself, depicted as a green-skinned deity lying flat with grass and crops growing out of his body. Geb was supposed to make the dust of Egypt fertile and orderly. To turn the dust into a stinging swarm was to strip him of his domain in front of his own priests. Pharaoh does not summon Moses this time. He says nothing. He simply waits in his throne room while his country itches itself raw for days. The lice eventually subside on their own as the plague runs its course. But the temples are still defiled, and the priesthood is humiliated. Pharaoh's heart hardens again. He has watched his magicians break and confess the finger of God. He has not changed his own mind. Plague 3. Geb, the god of the earth, exposed as powerless. The magicians have surrendered. Pharaoh has not. The escalation continues. The fourth plague. The first plague where God draws an explicit line between his people and Pharaoh's people. The first plague designed to make the distinction unmistakable. The Hebrew word used is arov, swarms, probably a mixture of biting flies and gadflies, the kind that draw blood and lay eggs in open wounds. Moses delivers the warning at the riverbank in the morning, while Pharaoh is performing his ritual greeting of the Nile with his retinue of priests. By midday, black clouds of biting flies descend on Egypt. They cover every house, every market, every grain pile, every face. An Egyptian baker tries to knead dough with flies crawling in his eyes and his nostrils and his mouth. Every loaf is contaminated before it reaches the oven. Egyptian children scream and bury their faces in their mothers' robes. Their bare arms and legs are covered with welts within an hour of stepping outside. Egyptian sacred cattle lie down in their pens, refusing to graze, their flanks black with feeding insects. The text records something new. But in the land of Goshen, where my people Israel dwell, no flies will be there. Goshen is named explicitly. The line is drawn. Egyptian magicians do not even attempt to compete this time. They have already conceded at the lice. Now they hide in their houses with the rest of the country. The Egyptian god struck down by name in this plague is Khepri, the scarab beetle-headed god of the rising sun and creation, depicted as a man with the head of a beetle. Khepri was supposed to roll the sun across the sky each morning, the way a scarab rolls a dung ball across the desert. To send swarms of unclean insects was to weaponize his own sacred form against his own kingdom. Pharaoh summons Moses again. He bargains. "Sacrifice your God in this land. You may worship, but you may not leave." Moses refuses. "The sacrifices we offer are an abomination to the Egyptians. We must go 3 days into the wilderness, as the Lord has commanded." Pharaoh agrees, only do not go very far. He pleads for entreaty. The flies depart by morning, and Pharaoh hardens his heart yet again. Plague 4. Khepri, the rising sun god, exposed as powerless. The boundary line is drawn. Israel is being separated from Egypt before our eyes. The fifth plague, the first plague to kill on a national scale. The first plague to strike the Egyptian economy at its very root. The Hebrew word here is daver, pestilence, a devastating disease specific to livestock that did not affect humans, that did not affect Hebrew animals, that fell only on the herds of Egypt. Moses gives Pharaoh advance warning, naming the exact day the plague will fall. Tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land. By the next morning, the cattle of Egypt are sick. By midday they are staggering. By dusk, the hillsides are covered with dying animals. Egyptian shepherds run from herd to herd, finding their finest cows and bulls collapsed in the grass. Egyptian horses go down in their stables, foam on their lips. Egyptian camels in the trade caravans simply lie down and refuse to rise. The economy of Egypt loses an entire generation of livestock in 24 hours. Egyptian temple priests inspect their sacred Apis bull, the living incarnation of one of their highest gods, and find him dead in his stable at Memphis. And in the land of Goshen, the Hebrew flocks graze peacefully. Hebrew cattle lift their heads at the same time the Egyptian herds collapse, and walk on as if nothing has changed. Pharaoh sends investigators to count the Hebrew livestock. The report comes back. Not one animal of Israel has died. The line is now visible to every official in the kingdom. The Egyptian deities struck down by name in this plague are Hathor and Apis. Hathor, the cow-headed goddess of motherhood and joy. Apis, the sacred bull who carried the sun disk between his horns. Hathor and Apis were two of the highest deities in the Egyptian pantheon. To strike the cattle was to slay the gods themselves in their own sacred image. Pharaoh sees the carnage and knows what it means. The cow goddess is dead in her own temple. The bull god lies stiff in his stable. He says nothing. He summons no one. He retreats into his throne room and waits for the disease to run its course on its own without intervention. By the end of the day, the smell of dying livestock has reached every corner of Egypt. The fields will be silent for a generation. Plague 5. Hathor and Apis, the cattle gods of Egypt, exposed as powerless. The economy is gutted. The hardness of Pharaoh's heart deepens. The sixth plague. The first plague to attack the Egyptian body itself. The first plague to drive the magicians out of Pharaoh's court entirely. The Hebrew word here is shechen, painful boil. Open festering ulcers that erupt on the skin of every Egyptian within hours of the trigger sign. Moses and Aaron are commanded to take handfuls of soot from the brick kilns of Egypt, the very kilns where Hebrew slaves baked the bricks of Pharaoh's city. They throw the soot up into the air in front of Pharaoh's eyes. The black ash spreads across the sky and becomes a fine dust that settles on every human and every remaining animal. Wherever the dust touches Egyptian skin, painful boils break out. Within hours, every Egyptian is covered in raw, weeping ulcer. An Egyptian noblewoman pulls back her linen gown to find her arms and her chest covered with red, erupting blisters. She cannot lie down. She cannot sit. She cannot sleep. Egyptian children cry through the night. The boils crack open and weep clear fluid. Every movement is agony for every body in the kingdom. The court magicians, who had already failed at lice and stayed silent at flies, are now physically unable to stand before Pharaoh because of the boils on their own body. And in the land of Goshen, the Hebrew slaves continue to mix straw and clay for the brickyard. Their skin is unmarked. Their wives sleep peacefully in cool tents. The Egyptian deities struck down by name in this plague are Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of plague and healing, and Imhotep, the deified physician of the third dynasty worshipped as the god of medicine. Sekhmet and Imhotep were the gods Egyptians prayed to when they got sick. To send a plague that the doctors themselves could not endure was to silence the priesthood of healing entirely. Pharaoh, for the first time in this sequence, says nothing. He does not summon Moses. He does not bargain. He sits in pain and refuses to bend. The text records that the Lord himself hardens Pharaoh's heart at this point. no longer just letting the king's stubbornness run its course. The judgment has now passed beyond simple negotiation. The boils begin to scab and heal as the days pass. Egyptian families nurse each other through fevers. The country itself feels like a hospital under one ruined roof. Plague 6. Sekhmet and Imhotep, the gods of healing, exposed as powerless. Egypt's body is broken. Pharaoh's heart is a stone. The 7th plague. The first plague to kill humans by name. The first plague where God offers Egyptians an explicit chance to save themselves by listening to the warning. The Hebrew word used is barad, hail mingled with fire. Massive hailstones falling alongside continuous flashing thunderbolts that ran along the ground in rivers of fire. Moses delivers the warning to Pharaoh in the morning. There has never been such hail in Egypt since the kingdom was founded. Bring your servants and your cattle indoors, or they will die. Some Egyptian officials, hearing this warning, actually obey. They feared the word of the Lord and brought their slaves and cattle into shelter. Others ignored it and left their fields exposed. Moses stretches his staff toward the sky. The clouds gather. Lightning begins to split the air over the entire kingdom of Egypt at once. Hail the size of a man's fist falls in continuous waves. Lightning runs along the ground in rivers of fire that burn the standing barley and the early wheat to char. Egyptian shepherds caught outside die in the open with their flocks beside them. Egyptian field workers running for shelter are struck dead in mid-stride. Egyptian groves of fig and pomegranate are stripped bare. The flax used for linen is destroyed across the whole delta. Every standing crop is flattened, and in the land of Goshen, where the Hebrew slaves dwell, no hail fell. The fields of Goshen remained green and unbruised in the middle of a continent of fire. The Egyptian goddess struck down by name in this plague is Nut, the sky goddess whose arched body was painted across temple ceilings as the protective dome over Egypt. Nut was supposed to keep the sky orderly and the storms harmless. To open her body and rain fire and ice through her was to strip her of her dome before her own priests. Pharaoh summons Moses urgently. I have sinned this time. The Lord is righteous, and I and my people are wicked. Entreat the Lord that there be no more thundering and hail. Moses leaves the city, lifts his hands toward heaven, and the storm stops in mid-sky. The hail ceases. The lightning is silent. But the moment Pharaoh sees that the hail and the rain and the thunders have ceased, his heart hardens once again, and he refuses to let Israel go. Plague 7. Nut the sky goddess, exposed as powerless. Pharaoh has confessed sin and reversed himself in a single day. The pattern is now public. The 8th plague. The plague that finally divides Pharaoh's own court against him. The plague after which his own officials beg him to surrender to the God of the Hebrew. The Hebrew word here is arbe, locusts. The kind of dense black swarm that can strip a continent of every green leaf in a single afternoon. Moses delivers the warning at the throne. Tomorrow I will bring locusts into your country, and they shall cover the face of the earth so that no one can see the ground. This time something extraordinary happened. Pharaoh's own servants turn to him and plead, how long shall this man be a snare to us? Let the men go. Do you not yet know that Egypt is destroyed? Pharaoh tries to bargain. Go, you and the men, but leave your women and children and herds behind. He still wants hostages against the Hebrews returning. Moses refuses. We will go with our young and our old, our sons and our daughters, our flocks and our herds. Pharaoh drives Moses and Aaron out of his presence in fury. Moses stretches his staff over the land of Egypt. An east wind blows for an entire day and an entire night. By morning, the locusts arrive in clouds so thick they darken the sun at noon. The locusts cover every square inch of ground until the soil cannot be seen. They eat every leaf, every fruit, every blade of grass that the hail had left behind. Egyptian farmers stand in the doorways of their homes and watch a year's worth of harvest disappear in a single afternoon. Egyptian children clutch the last loaves their mothers can salvage. And in the land of Goshen, where the Hebrew slaves dwell, The wheat fields remain untouched. The Hebrew children eat fresh bread at the same hour the Egyptian children go hungry. The Egyptian god struck down by name in this plague is Senehem, the locust-headed protector of crops, sometimes paired with Seth, the god of chaotic storm winds from the desert. Senehem was supposed to keep the locusts away from Egypt. To send a swarm so dense it eclipsed the sun was to humiliate the very God whose only job was to prevent this catastrophe. Pharaoh hastily calls back Moses and Aaron. I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Forgive my sin only this once and entreat the Lord to remove this death from me. Moses prays. A west wind drives the locusts into the Red Sea, every last one. Not one locust remains in all the territory of Egypt. And Pharaoh's heart hardens once more. Plague 8. Senehem, the protector of crops, exposed as powerless. Pharaoh's own court has begged him to surrender. He refused them all. The 9th plague. The plague that strikes the highest god in the entire Egyptian pantheon. The plague that makes Egypt go silent for 3 full days. The Hebrew word used is choshek, thick darkness, not nightfall, not eclipse. A darkness so heavy that a man could feel it pressing on his skin like a weight. Moses stretches his staff toward heaven without warning Pharaoh first this time. The sky over Egypt simply turns black at midday under a clear noon sun. An Egyptian priest in the temple of Karnak, in the middle of his noon offering, suddenly cannot see the altar in front of his face. The torches will not light. The wicks will not catch fire. Egyptian families freeze in their homes. No one rises from his place for 3 days. No one can find his neighbor. No one can light a single lamp in any city. Egyptian merchants in the great market squares of Memphis and Thebes simply sit down where they are and wait for the dark to lift, having no other choice. Egyptian children cling to their mothers. Egyptian fathers reach for their wives in the dark and hold them without speaking. The whole country becomes a tomb. And in the land of Goshen, the Hebrew slaves had light in their dwellings, lamps still lit, mothers still cooked, children still played in the lit doorways while a wall of dark stood over Egyptian rooftops a few miles away. The Egyptian god struck down by name in this plague is Ra, the chief god of Egypt, the sun god, the deity whose name was carried as part of Pharaoh's own royal title, son of Ra. Ra was the highest god in the Egyptian pantheon. To extinguish the sun for 3 days while leaving Hebrew lamps burning was to declare the supreme god of Egypt powerless against the God of Israel. On the 4th morning, Pharaoh emerges from his throne room and summons Moses. Go serve the Lord. Only let your flocks and your herds be left behind. Moses refuses again. Our cattle also shall go with us. Not a hoof shall be left behind. Pharaoh erupts in fury at the answer. Get away from me. Take heed to yourself. See my face no more, for in the day you see my face you shall die. The king's voice fills the throne room. Moses replies, You have spoken well. I will see your face again no more. And he walks out of Pharaoh's palace for the last time in human history. Plague 9. Ra, the sun god, exposed as powerless. The supreme deity of Egypt has been silenced. Only one chance remains for Egypt. The 10th plague. The plague that strikes Pharaoh himself. The plague that finally breaks the heart that no other plague could move from its stone foundation. The Hebrew phrase is makat becharot, the smiting of the firstborn. Every firstborn male in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh on his throne, to the firstborn of the maidservant at her grindstone. Moses delivers the final warning before Pharaoh, then walks out of the palace and gives the Hebrew slaves their detailed instructions for the night ahead. Each Hebrew family is to take a perfect lamb without blemish, slaughter it at twilight, and brush its blood onto the wooden lintel and the 2 doorposts of their house with a bunch of hyssop. Inside, they are to roast the lamb whole and eat it standing, dressed for travel, with their staffs in their hands and sandals on their feet, ready to leave Egypt before dawn. At midnight, a sound goes up across the land of Egypt that has never been heard before. A single great cry from every Egyptian household, because there is not a house where one is not dead. Pharaoh rises in the night and finds his own firstborn son dead in his bed. The boy who was supposed to inherit the throne of Egypt is gone before the dawn breaks. Egyptian noblewomen wail over the still bodies of their oldest sons. Egyptian field laborers find their oldest boys cold beside the morning bread. Egyptian cattle stables hold the firstborn of every herd dead in their stalls. And in the land of Goshen, behind doorposts brushed with lamb's blood, every Hebrew firstborn breathes peacefully through the night. The angel of death sees the blood and passes over the house. The Egyptian god struck down by name in this plague is Pharaoh himself. The Egyptian king was considered the living son of Ra, a divine being on a divine throne, the bridge between gods and men. To kill the firstborn of Pharaoh was to kill the next generation of the divine dynasty itself. The god-king's own line was severed in a single night with no warning. Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron in the dark. Rise up and go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel. Take your flocks and your herds. Be gone, and bless me also. By dawn, 600,000 Hebrew men, plus women and children and herds, are walking out of Egypt with the silver and gold the Egyptians pressed into their hands to make them leave faster. On the 14th day of the first month, at twilight, the Israelites kept the Passover for the first time. The lamb was slaughtered. The blood was placed. The deliverance had come at last. Plague 10. Pharaoh himself, the god-king of Egypt, exposed as powerless against the God of Israel. The judgment is complete. The Exodus has begun. 10 plagues. 10 gods called out by name. 10 chances offered to a king who refused to bend until his own son lay dead in his arms before dawn. Hapi the river, Heqet of birth, Geb of dust, Khepri of dawn, Hathor and Apis of cattle, Sekhmet and Imhotep of healing, Nut of sky, Senehem of harvest, Ra of sun, and finally Pharaoh himself. Each plague was not a random calamity. Each was a courtroom verdict. Each declared the same sentence. The God of Israel is greater than every god of Egypt. And 1,400 years later, the Apostle Paul would write that Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed for us. The blood on the doorposts in Goshen prefigured the blood at Calvary. That is every plague of Egypt, read in order, read in Hebrew, read all the way through to the Lamb whose blood made the angel of death pass over.